Live from New York City, it's the Gary Null Show. And now, your host, Gary Null.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Null, broadcasting and today video streaming live from our studios in New York City. And I'd like to welcome you. You can watch today's program by going to Progressive Radio Network Facebook and see this. Today, the latest on health and healing. Then I'm going to extend the amount of time that I give to our guest. We have a very important guest, part of our Conversations with Remarkable Minds. He is Professor Rashid Khalidi, and he is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University and Director of the Middle East Institute at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. And we're going to talk about the U.S.-Israeli-Saudi alliance and what it means for the future of the Middle East. So a lot of the questions that have not been answered honestly by this administration or members of Congress will address. Also, how do you get into Harvard? Well, new information based upon this lawsuit shows several ways, and none of them are they bragging about the reality of Harvard. Many of us have felt this way a long time, and we'll go into that. And I will take some calls later on in the program. But we always begin with the latest on health and healing. A new study talks about when fathers exercise, children are healthier even as adults. Now, this is from Ohio State University. And what it's showing is that men who want to have children in the near future should consider hitting the gym. A new study led by a physiologist and cell biologist researcher at Ohio State University College of Medicine shows that exercise had a significant impact on the metabolic health of offspring well into their adulthood. Now, this is a part of that epigenetics. What happens early in life can impact us later in life. This was published in the Journal of Diabetes. My suggestion is that fathers exercise for at least 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, and a half hour of resistance exercising. That's the ideal. Not only will it help you have a healthier child, it's going to allow you to add about 10 years onto your lifespan. And that's also true for women as well. We are not exercising enough. Now, there are people who exercise every day. Some people over-exercise. But for the average American, too much sitting, and that's not good. Also today, a new study, and I try to bring you the newest studies. This is also important for exercising, but specifically for cancer care for all patients. The Institute of Gustave Roussy and of Curie in France found that including exercise or sports as part of cancer care can significantly improve symptom management, quality of life, and fitness during and after treatment. So if you're sick, if you have cancer, then by all means make sure you're getting exercise, because a lot of people don't. And as a result, they begin to lose muscle mass and with that energy. So do your exercises at least to the degree you can every day, even water aerobics. It can make a big difference in the outcome of your disease. Also, I want to mention that everyone, including children, should be exercising as well. A lot of children are becoming overweight and obese because they're not exercising. So we got to get all kids exercising. We have an epidemic of obesity and diabetes, in adult diabetes, in children. We have more overweight children per population than any other country on the planet. That's our lifestyle. Bad diet and not exercising. Lots of animal proteins and saturated fats. That's setting our children up to be diseased their entire life and to live shorter lives. And indeed, we are living shorter lives. And it's going down substantially over the next 10 years. If the model I'm looking at is correct, we'll knock 5 years off the average lifespan. That's bringing us back into the low 60s or mid 60s. And we thought we'd made all this advancement. We have not. So vigorous exercising, aerobics, dance, even fast swimming, all improve your metabolism. And that's what you want. Another study talks about the turmeric, turmeric, in your breakfast, and it improves memory. This is from Monash University in Australia, and it's published in the Asian Pacific Journal of Clinical Nutrition, a highly respected journal. And what they did, they tested the working memory of men and women aged 60 and older in Taiwan who had been recently diagnosed with untreated prediabetes. In this placebo-controlled study, they were either given 1 gram, which is 1,000 milligrams of turmeric, or otherwise just a plain nutrition supplement with nothing in it. And they found that there was a improvement in working memory. So now think of the nearly 100 million people in the United States over 60 who are losing their memories. And that's most of the people. In fact, almost all my friends who are 60 and over have memory, some short memory lapse, some long-term memory, but simply taking turmeric. You can take a turmeric capsule, and that'll improve it. From Tel Aviv University, cannabis improves symptoms of Crohn's disease despite having no effect in gut inflammation. So, in the first study of its kind, cannabis oil has been shown to significantly improve the symptoms of Crohn's disease and the quality of life of sufferers. And that's important. This was a randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blind study. So cannabis oil can produce clinical remission in up to 65% of individuals after 8 weeks of treatment. We already know that it helps with seizures, with migraine headaches, with brain cancer, with lung cancer. It's very good. So, this should also be one of the things, and also overall pain relief. I've also seen it help people with other itises in the intestine, colitis, spastic colon, as well as Crohn's disease. We're talking about millions of Americans suffer from these conditions. Also, one of the reasons you should eat broccoli is selenium. Why? Because it can help fight melanoma. University of Copenhagen did a study. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to look at a common food. And they want to look at a common mineral. Well, selenium is a mineral which naturally occurs in broccoli and garlic and appears to slow down the progress that allows cancer such as melanoma and prostate cancer and leukemia to spread. Now, these types of cancers contain mechanisms that block the body's ability to recognize and destroy them by causing the immune system to overactivate. So by taking in selenium, by eating your broccoli, and by the way, why not have garlic sautéed with broccoli? That's a delicious dish. Pour nice sauce over it. 2 separate items right there, garlic and broccoli, rich in selenium, and can help if you have cancer. And that can help it from spreading. So the entire bloodstream is, so to speak, infected when you have cancer. And therefore, the selenium helps in the detoxification, helps block cancer from spreading. That's what we want. That's a good thing. Also, there's a natural treatment for colitis that you probably have never heard of. Red ginseng powder, fermented with probiotics. This is from the Chongbuk National University in South Korea. Brand new study, just out today. And it shows the anti-inflammatory products that come from red ginseng, Panax, P-A-N-A-X ginseng. There are lots of studies on this. So you have the beneficial activity of fermented foods loaded with probiotic bacteria that improve gut health. Well, Korean researchers report that fermenting red ginseng and adding probiotics to it made it very effective in remedying the inflammation caused by colitis. And colitis, just so you don't know, is a disease where the inner lining of the colon becomes irritated and swells and causes allergic reactions, autoimmune reactions like inflammatory bowel diseases and bacterial infections. Red ginseng is a medicinal herb used in traditional Korean and Chinese medicine, and it's used to treat many ailments that stem from uncontrolled inflammation. And the root of the ginseng contains large amounts of saponin, saponin. And when it reaches the intestine, saponin is preceded by gut bacteria that are useful in supporting your immune system. So, if you have gut problems, fermented probiotics with Korean red ginseng, and that can make a big difference. And that's what we want. Probiotic fermented red ginseng, able to bring down the amount of cytokines for intestinal reaction. And also green tea. I'm a big believer in green tea. Green tea plus exercise can speed up weight loss. Penn State University, in laboratory experiment, giving decaffeinated green tea and exercise regularly, experienced a sharp reduction in body weight and significant improvements in health. And after 16 weeks, the mice showed an average body loss of 27%. That's a lot of abdominal fat that is lost. And so this was done in Penn State's College of Agricultural Science. And it was published in Molecular Nutrition Food Research. So people could realize similar benefits. So just something else. I want to bring everything that I know, green tea and exercise. So if you take your green tea in the morning, for a human I would say 200 to 400 milligrams. That's not a lot. You could get that in 1 to 2 tablets or a couple glasses of green tea a day. And finally, garlic can help keep our brains healthy. This in University of Missouri. A nutrient in garlic can offer the brain cell protection against aging and disease. Quote, garlic is one of the most widely consumed dietary supplements, according to the School of Medicine there, lead author, and the team looked at the nutrient's ability to inhibit and even possibly reverse brain cell damage caused by the environment, like smoking, pollution, and trauma to the brain, or excessive alcohol consumption. And what he found was the, quote, microglia are immune cells in the brain and spinal cord that are the first and main line of defense in the central nervous system. And like other mature brain cells that seldom regenerate themselves, the microglial cells respond to inflammation and environmental stresses by multiplying. So by massing themselves and migrating towards an injury site, they're able to respond to inflammation and protect other brain cells from destruction. So if we simply increase the number of the microglial cells, we could also increase the amount of nitric oxide in the brain, and excessive production of nitric oxide leads to brain cell damage and promotes neurodegeneration cells and cerebral ischemia, Parkinson's disease, etc. So what they found was that by creating a different model, they were able to make an enormous difference in the brain. So here's the takeaway message in just lay language, because sometimes I try to share some of the actual science from these, and if you're not a scientist, it may be a little bit confusing. Garlic has nutrients that can protect your brain, that can keep this process of excessive inflammation from occurring. That's what it means. Whether it's liquid garlic, whether you juice the garlic, whether you eat the garlic, or even lightly saute the garlic, it's all good. So consider that. Garlic is not just good for lowering blood pressure and killing bacteria in your throat and intestine, and helps with your stomach and turns off inflammation in your gut, and is good for your blood, but now benefits the brain. Oh, and one last thing on that Korean red ginseng. There's another university study that shows that the Korean red ginseng can help in the progression of non-alcoholic status fatidus, and that is the latest research. So one more reason to use it. It's a metabolic disorder, including diabetes and fatty liver. It can help with all that. So Korean ginseng is good for the body, good for the liver, good for inflammation. We're just not taking enough of it in our society. I'll do one last thing, and that is raw organic honey can save your microbiome. This is from Green Med Info. And that there are billions of years of biological information encoded within your cells. And that, depending upon what you do or do not eat, that information is activated or remains latent. We now know that we are more microbial than human. In other words, we might have 75 trillion cells, but we have 10 times that more bacteria, viral and fungal cells than actual human cells. And we more accurately describe, at least in biological terms, as a meta-organism than let's say, just a human body isolated from the outside life. Perhaps even more profound is the fact that the total genetic information in our bodies is about 99% microbial in origin, with many of these microbes performing life-sustaining functions for digestion, immunity, even cognition. Everything in your gut. Your brain isn't controlling that. That's a separate type of bioregulator. Even when we explore only the private genetic contributions of our cells, we find that the human genome is about 10% viral or retroviral in origin, and that our mitochondria, that's our energy factories, are actually alien in origin. Somewhere around 1.5 billion years ago, an ancient bacteria entered into a symbiotic relationship with our cells to perform both oxygen detoxifying and energy-producing functions by losing their independence and becoming our mitochondria. So when we look at ourselves through this microbial lens, where we end and the living and breathing environment begins is no longer as clear as the boundary of our skin. What we eat or expose ourselves to chemically, for instance, not only becomes crucial in the significance in determining the state of our health and disease risk, but to our very identity. And this information is beginning to affect the way we look at ourselves as a species in evolutionary terms. In fact, the hologenome theory of evolution states that we are a holobiont, meaning a host whose fate is and always was inseparably bound to all of its symbiotic microbes. How can I say this? Make it even simpler. As with all classical evolutionary theory, on our own genes evolve, selective pressures from the environment have shaped the types and numbers of microbes that now form the basis of both our health and disease susceptibility. And what are some of the most important selective pressures that have gone into creating our cells over the course of unimaginably vast time period? Dietary, environmental, cultural ones, of course. And when Hippocrates says we are what we eat, this was true not only in molecular terms, such as food we eat, produce molecular building blocks from which our bodies are constructed, but also in the microbial terms, the microbes we expose ourselves to and cultivate through the nutrition affects and permanently alters our holobiont selves, which leads us to the topic of honey and the microbial time travel. Honey, and you've heard me mention this many times in this program, is the only food in the world that will never go bad. And so when we often think of our cave ancestry as being shaped primarily by their meat-based diet and the, let's say, harnessing a fire for cooking and acquiring and eating honey may have been an equal crucial dietary determinant in our evolutionary trajectory as well. According to one researcher, a Dr. Elise Crittenden, honey helped make us human. It appears that the human sweet tooth has been around since human evolution began, and new research proposes that honey may have been important in human evolution. Upper Paleolithic, about 8,000 to 40,000 years ago, rock art from all around the world depicts images of early humans collecting honey, and the images range from figures climbing ladders to access hives residing high in the trees to figures smoking out hives filled with honeycomb. And honey and bee larvae are important foods consumed by many populations of hunters and gatherers worldwide. And foragers in Latin America, Asia, Australia, and Africa include honey and bee larvae as major components of their diet. And the Hasda, which is, let's go back a little bit, the Hasda, Hadza, hunter-gatherers of Tanzania, the population was done doing the research on this, while our ancestors may have consumed honey, what does it have to do with our microbiology today, our identity? Well, honey actually contains a range of beneficial microbes contributed by bees and the plants they forage, including lactic acid-producing bacteria, the lactobacilli. And when we eat raw honey, it can contribute health-promoting strains to our bodies. And these bacteria have been identified as indispensable to the immunity of the individual and the hive as a whole, as well as in affecting the behavior and different types of bees that inhabit these complex colonies. So considering the possibility of our ancient coevolutionary relationship with honey, is it possible that our own immune systems and our own microbial populations share dependency on honey-based microbes? Yes, it is the case. So when you think of something like just honey, could honey heal wounds? Yes, it does heal wounds. Manuka honey is the most powerful healing honey in the world. But bee propolis, I suggest everyone. I just returned yesterday. I'm just staying a part of the week, and I have to go back out again. And 4 friends said they got colds and flu. All right. Bee propolis, raw honey, probiotics. What do they all have in common? They are flooding the body with microorganisms. Those microorganisms break down into the gut. Billions, hundreds of billions of them exist in the gut. They communicate with each other. The bifidobacterium, the lactobacillus bacterium. And these come from bees. And some of these are over 80 million years old. That means that honeybees and their honey may contain bacteria that humans may have maintained contact with and ingested throughout the entire course of the evolution as foragers of honey. So when you think about, well, why is a probiotic good for you? It's just a fermented product. What exactly is the ferment? It's bacteria. Why do you think that those of us like myself who grew up exposed to nature, out in the country, playing in barns, living my whole adult life, I've either owned and lived on a farm, the Fertile Farm upstate for 14 years, at the Healing Springs Ranch for 8 years, nearly 7 years down in Texas, the Prairie Gardens down in Florida for 23 years, around animals, around nature. You're bringing in microorganisms. Your body identifies the microorganisms, destroys the toxic ones, but incorporates the good ones into your biome, and therefore you're going to be far stronger than if you're living in these sanitized bubbles that people do. That's the microculture. Today we are not getting the exposure to nature we need. We're not stimulating the immune system of children by letting them be in nature. We're not greening them. We're controlling them, and that's not good. So have your honey, and you're getting good strains of bacteria into your body, and that's what you need. When you're eating medicinal mushrooms, you're also getting good fungus into the body. Sugar is giving you the wrong kind of fungus to grow. Sounds a little complicated. It's actually not that complicated, but it's important. I'm Gary Null. That's the latest on health and healing. We're going to take a break and come right back. I look forward to sharing our guest information in about 6 minutes. And I'm going to ask if anyone just attended our retreat. We had phenomenal results. I mean, you can't imagine how many results we had. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Give us a call. I want to thank all the people who've supported our sister station, WBAI, where you're listening to this program going on 43 years. The longest-running daily non-commercial radio program in American history, and on WBAI plus PFW for 35 years, KPFK, 33 years, 6 hours a week. So we've helped that community, still helping it. And I was ready all last week, but the station wasn't ready to get on the air with some live pitching. I'll be doing that starting tomorrow, following this regular broadcast at 1 o'clock. Look forward to helping because they're in great need of help right now. They're kind of tanking in their efforts, so hopefully we can do that. But the good news is every single premium was able to be purchased from the last retreat plus leftover, and they're all getting out the door to you. I asked a question at the beginning of the program. How can you help get into Harvard, right? Well, according to Arwa Madawal, did a report, and based upon if you've been reading the lawsuit brought by some Asian Americans, they're saying they're grossly prejudiced against. It's true. They've had to acknowledge that. The top person in admissions has admitted, laid it all out. If you're a regular person, you can have a low score and get in. But if you're an Asian American, you got to have a very high score to get in. That's bias by any measure. And those people have to work harder, and still they're prejudiced against. But there's another way to get into parents. Have super rich parents with a checkbook and a pen. Yeah, that'll get you in frequently. So here's the deal. Persuade your parents to give the university a nice gift. According to this report, a new building. Have them build a building. Or perhaps $1 million for a fellowship. That sort of thing, it is very, very good. It's long been understood that you can, to some extent, buy your way into many of the U.S. prestigious universities. And there are certainly plenty of examples of people with more money than common sense or academic standards being admitted to elite educational institutions. Jared Kushner, for example, the president's son-in-law, got into Harvard despite having mediocre academic record. To be fair, this may have nothing to do with the fact that his father pledged $2.5 million to Harvard University shortly before he was accepted. Probably just a coincidence. Perhaps the admission office just had a hunch that this guy was going to be the next genius and allowed him in. And while it's no secret that offering financial gifts to certain Ivy League universities may compensate for a lack of natural gifts, think of George Bush. Were there any gifts there outside that someone might like to have a beer with him? But then, hey, if your name is Bush, you can go to Harvard, you can go to Princeton, go wherever you want. Someone will do the work for you. Generally do. In fact, there was a group of people, there still are, lots of people. We're talking about thousands of people. You pay them enough money, they'll do your thesis, they'll do everything for you. Rich people can afford that. Average people can't. So, in part, we're finding out a lot of this based upon the lawsuit currently underway against Harvard that accuses the university of discriminating against Asian Americans. In seeking to determine how Asian Americans are treated by Harvard, the lawsuit has unearthed a number of internal university documents that give unprecedented insight into its seemingly money-centric admissions process. And there's a 2013 email exchange among Harvard administrators, for example, and was presented at the trial last Wednesday. In one email, subject line, "My hero," the dean of the university's Kennedy School of Government commends the dean of admissions for doing a great job in extending offers to students with rich, generous parents. Quote, "I'm simply thrilled about the folks you were able to admit." Redacted, the name, has already committed to a building. Whoa. Other people described as, quote, big wins in the email were connected to donors who had, quote, committed major money for fellowships. Another email made public in the trial talked about rolling out the red carpet for an applicant whose family had donated $1.1 million to Harvard. There's also the email exchange in which a Harvard development officer and an admissions dean discuss how much money they are likely to extract from a candidate. Quote, "Going forward, I don't see a significant opportunity for further major gifts." Names redacted, has an art collection which considerably could come our way. More probably, it'll go to a museum. And while the lawsuit has brought attention to the way in which donations and admissions are intertwined at Harvard, this wasn't its primary motive. The case brought by a nonprofit organization headed by a controversial conservative, Edward Blum, is rather more complicated than that, and I'll get into this on upcoming programs. But the bottom line is this. There's this myth in America that if you go to an Ivy League school, you must be smarter. You must be of that rare genetic stock that should be leading the country. You should be one of the best and brightest. It's your name who should be as a president of a corporation or major person. These are all myths. You could go to a state university and get the same quality education as any of the Ivy League schools. I think it's time that we began to expose this whole myth that the Ivy Leagues are unique, special, gifted to go there, to graduate from there. You should be deferred to because of your scholarship. I'm Gary Null, and we have our guest on hold. We're going to go to our guest in just 1 minute here. I just want to mention also that wherever possible, I like to hire people from our audience. There's a gazillion people out there who are qualified, who could use jobs, but if someone has been a regular listener, I'd like to hire you. And we're going to be interviewing in the near future for more citizen journalists, and I'm going to be training people who have the time and desire to go around the United States or around the world to bring us the stories that the networks are not. So that's going to be happening. Also, I have a position open, which is fun. It's an animal caretaker position, someone who at the animal sanctuary would be able to be around, maintain, feed, and love capuchins and ring-tailed lemurs and donkeys and swans and creatures that I have helped to rescue and rehabilitate and find them homes. Full pay, room and board, or room, and nice accommodations. If you're interested, that's something you'd like to do. You'd have to relocate to Florida. I'm going to start with this audience before I go locally. I can find a lot of people locally, but I don't know who they are. They don't know who I am. Just send your application to prnstudio@gmail.com, prnstudio@gmail.com. Back in a moment with my guest. Please stay with us. Nice to have you with us, everyone. On the phone right now from New York City is Professor Rashid Khalidi. As I mentioned earlier, he is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University and the Director of the Middle East Institute at Columbia School of International Public Affairs. He also serves as the editor of the Journal of Palestinian Studies. With a Palestinian heritage, he is world-renowned as a historian specializing in the history of national identity in the Middle East and the role of foreign powers in the region. He has served as the first president of the American Committee on Jerusalem, now known as the American Task Force in Palestine. He has appeared on many notable programs like the NewsHour and Morning Edition Nightline. He holds a degree from Yale University, a doctorate from Oxford University, and he has also taught at American University in Beirut, University of Chicago, Georgetown University. He has written many books. His forthcoming is The 100-Year War on Palestine. Nice to have you with us today.
Thanks, Gary. Good to be with you.
All of the news has been focused on the assassination of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And what seems clear is that there is a Caligula, or Nero, ruling over Saudi Arabia now. That's my personal opinion. I could be wrong on that. Last year, Prince Mohammed bin Salman had detained hundreds of royal family members and Saudi elite and office holders shortly after a long meeting he had with Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Last November, Salman even kidnapped and detained Lebanon's Prime Minister, Said Hariri, when he arrived to visit the monarchy. No doubt he would like to see a regime change in Lebanon, too. And it seems that he will pick fights with any nation in the region he pleases, for example, more recently with Qatar because of its business relationship with Iran and perhaps later with Oman. I feel that bin Salman is an enormous destabilizing force throughout the Middle East now. What is your assessment of the prince, and where does he plan to take Saudi Arabia as a military power in the region, knowing that he has the full cooperation and support at this moment of the United States and of Israel, of the United Arab Emirates? Those are definite. The others are possible, such as Great Britain. The forum is yours.
Well, I think that the comparison that I would make to the kind of centralized absolute monarchy that has been instituted since King Salman took over in 2015 and installed his younger son, Mohammed bin Salman, as the crown prince, the comparison I would make is to something like Louis XIV, the kind of absolute monarchy you had in France, or the kind of absolute monarchy that you had in Britain, in England, before King John was forced to accept Magna Carta and some limits were imposed on his power. This is a completely untrammeled, unlimited, absolute monarchy. Saudi Arabia was always an absolute monarchy, but there was a ever since it was established in 1902, and became Saudi Arabia in 1926. But there was always, within at least the royal family, and among the families related to the royal family, a certain give and take, a certain degree of collegial leadership. This has ended as of 2015 with King Salman taking over and appointing his son as crown prince, and he has centralized absolutely all power in his hands. He's taken over the army, the National Guard, the defense ministry, intelligence service, divesting every branch of the royal family that had formerly controlled these institutions of all of their power, and in many cases taking their money in this heist that took place at the Ritz-Carlton a little more than a year ago. So it is the most absolute monarchy on earth, the most unlimited form of power, and I would compare it to, as I've said, France in the age of the most absolute, or England in the age of the most absolute monarchy.
Earlier this year, news was reported about normalizing the official relationships between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and the prince had remarked that Israel had the right to have peace in their homeland, meaning Palestine. Both countries are determined to thwart any Iranian involvement in the region, whether it be to support Assad in Syria or the Houthis in Yemen. So we're finding that two countries that were for decades opposed to each other are now finding familiar ground as allies by sharing a common enemy, Iran. And I find this arrangement even more complicated with the U.S.'s involvement. John Bolton seems determined to bring a regime change in the Iranian Republic, and the Trump administration shows no sincere interest in dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and a peace accord, and it will simply be dictated by Netanyahu's demands. And a former top Mossad officer, Haim Tomer, confirmed to the Jerusalem Post last May that a U.S.-Israeli-Saudi alliance would topple the Iranian government. He said it's a perfect opportunity now with Trump in the White House. So please take your time and explain to us this triumvirate of the U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, and what are the goals that they are sharing together?
Well, Israel has for a very long time had a covert relationship with Saudi Arabia. There was no real opposition between the two countries from the very moment Israel was established. Israel came to realize that Saudi Arabia posed no threat whatsoever to it. And even though King Faisal and other earlier rulers of Saudi Arabia made various statements of support for the Palestinians, in fact, the Saudi-American relationship was the most important thing to them. It was far, far more important to the ruling family than Palestine. That has always been the case. And what has changed now is that under King Salman and his son, the Crown Prince, the Saudi regime seems much, much more willing to be overt about its relationship with Israel, as are countries like the United Arab Emirates, which is an ally, and Bahrain, which is an occupied country under Saudi rule, essentially a satellite of Saudi Arabia. These three countries have sent delegations to Israel, have sent officials to Israel, have negotiated semi-publicly with Israel. They still do not have formal diplomatic relations, though they do have, as I've said, regular covert interactions. And as you suggest in your question, the shared objective is Iran. Each of these countries has a different reason for being concerned about Iran. In the case of the Emirates, there's a territorial claim. Under the Shah, Iran took over some islands that the Emirates claim, and they've always been worried about Iranian power. In the case of Saudi Arabia, there is there's a long-standing rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, even back in the times of the Shah, but that increased with the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which created an Islamic Republic, which is a threat to Saudi Arabia ideologically, because it claims to be a proper Islamic state and casts doubt on the Islamic legitimacy of Saudi Arabia's regime. In addition, Iran is a large country. It's got 80 million people. It has a large industrial base, has a highly educated population, highly motivated, has an extraordinary ability to project power throughout the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has about 20 million people, much less well-educated, in fact. Women don't take part in public life to the degree that they do in Iran, and that means a very large chunk of the labor force is basically kept out and excluded, though many women in Saudi Arabia, of course, do work. And finally, Saudi Arabia is incapable of defending its own borders. The war in Yemen, which started with a rebellion against the central government by the Houthi movement in the north, has led to some very embarrassing situations where Saudi troops would get engaged with the Houthis, and the Houthis would enter into Saudi territory and penetrate miles and miles and miles without the Saudi military, which has spent tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars on American, British, and French weapons, completely incapable of stopping them. And these are like basically tribal infantrymen with light arms and some artillery support, humiliating one of the most well-equipped armies in the region. So Saudi Arabia cannot really defend itself against threats from any direction, and the regime can't defend itself against its own people, in as much as it's an absolute regime in which there's no representation, no parliament, no free press, no political parties, no freedom of political association, complete suppression of any form of dissent. And they need external support not only against external enemies, but against internal enemies. Israel has its own reasons for opposing Iran. Among them is the fact that Iran is a actual power in the region. It has allies and clients all over the region, including in Lebanon and in Syria and in Gaza. And it is opposed to Israel in a variety of arenas, in addition to which it's always useful, given that there are no Arab countries that have any military potential whatsoever at this stage. It's always useful to have an enemy to rally against. And so Iran is the convenient enemy. And Israel has never attempted to do what the Obama administration, in its half-hearted way, tried to do, which is to try and come to terms with Iran. On the contrary, the Netanyahu government and most Israeli governments before it prefer to avoid offers to negotiate, for example, from Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Hamas has been trying to do a deal with Israel for the longest time, and Israel much prefers the status quo. And I think that's the case vis-a-vis Iran. It's a convenient, distant enemy. It is a serious power. Iran is a major military power with, as I've said, quite extensive capability to project that power into countries right on the border of Israel. Israel doesn't like that. Israel likes to dominate its environment completely and totally. It does not like to have rivals or enemies anywhere near it, and it has crushed everybody who's risen up. Or, in the case of Syria, that has happened as a result of internal dissent, civil war, and external intervention.
I have a question that has many prongs to it, and I'd like to see if you could weave these together. One is that the excuse given by this administration, as well as the English administration and the French administration, is that, okay, so Saudi Arabia has admitted that this man was killed, but he got in a fist fight. Well, then why was a pathologist specifically sent with a hacksaw that's used to saw bones up? And why is it that there was 15 security agents that were sent? You don't do that if you're there to interrogate. You do that if these are hit teams. So they've been caught in lies, and then they lied about him being okay there and that he left. And when it turns out there's no evidence he left, there's evidence that he was killed. And I'm pretty sure that the president of Turkey in the very near future, probably this week, will release actual audio to show that there was no fist fight, that he was put into a chair, and from what I've been told, he was abused and threatened, and then they killed him and then dismembered his body. Then in came a cleaning team, and they left this just the same day and went back to Saudi Arabia. Be that as it may, we're told, okay, this was a bad thing, but we've got $100 billion in contracts. It represents an awful lot of American jobs. And so we have to look the other way. Then Bernie Sanders says that this is not good, and we should never do business with, have clients that we work with, client states, that engage in, torture or abuse or assassination of their own citizens. And I'm thinking, what about Israel? And before this, why is it that no major media, and this is another prong, until yesterday in the New York Times, showed that, gee whiz, there's also there's Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and the United States going into Yemen, the poorest country in the Middle East. They don't have a Navy, Air Force, satellites, submarines, nuclear. They have nothing. And yet in 2+ years, Saudi hasn't been able to destroy them and take that. And yet 29 million people are now at risk of the greatest problem in the world as far as the humanitarian crisis. 5,000 children are at immediate risk. 50,000 children, according to the report that I saw, have died, and yet that's being downplayed. All their civilian infrastructure, in violation of all international treaties, were intentionally bombed, including power plants, hospitals, places that are not military targets, and therefore you can't do that. That's a crime against humanity. The United States has supplied the weapons, the bombs, the intelligence, the satellites, even boots on the ground and advisors there participating, including hit teams. So now suddenly Last week, the Washington Post discovers Yemen, and there's a war. The New York Times reports on it as if somehow this is Trump's war. Well, it was first Obama and John Kerry's war. Before that, it was Hillary Clinton preparing them, Saudi Arabia, giving them munitions, the largest munitions contract, $96 million plus, $96 billion plus. They actually had a celebration at the State Department. So here we have, finally, they've discovered Yemen, where the world has been completely negligent on this. We even went back and checked MSNBC. Stormy Daniels, that was over 453 times, either her lawyer, or a discussion of it on the air. Nothing about Yemen and the humanitarian crisis, the cholera epidemics, the starvation in children, none of that. Now the last part of this is, we're said that, but they're an important ally in dealing with terrorists. Well, it didn't take us long. It took us under 2 days to find that Saudi Arabia is the number one funder in the Middle East of terrorist groups. And we have which terrorist groups they funded. Also, Erdogan and Turkey funded terrorists. They had an open door between ISIS fighters going through Turkey into Syria. Even his son was taking 10,000 trucks in, loading up, stealing Syrians' oil, bringing it back and selling on the black market. So here we have absolute proof that they've been aiding, abetting, funding these terrorist groups like al-Nusra and different divisions of al-Qaeda. They have all these schools supporting the most formidable and toxic form of fundamentalism, Wahhabism. They're not criticized for Wahhabism. They're not criticized for supporting terrorism. They're not criticized for being participants at some level in funding or protection or cover-up of 9/11. They're not criticized for the war in Yemen. They're not criticized for their blockade against Qatar. But they're our allies, and therefore the American public and Congress should go ahead and say, okay, you did a bad thing, don't do it again. What am I missing here that makes no sense whatsoever? Your thoughts?
Well, Gary, I'm not sure I see a question there, and if there were several questions, you seem to have answered them yourself. What can I say? Yes, and yes. There has been a shameful silence about the killing of thousands of people in Yemen by American weapons with American guidance and American support, and nobody discovered that that it was a bad thing for the Saudis to kill people until a journalist, who is actually much more than a journalist. He's someone who served as an advisor to members of the royal family. He's someone who's been employed by members of the royal family in Saudi Arabia. He's not a journalist. He's much more than a journalist. He was a journalist, but he was also a key figure in many stages of Saudi policy around the Middle East, including in Afghanistan, when they were supporting the jihad against the Soviet occupation of that country. Yes, of course, there's a hypocrisy there. Money can't buy you love, but it sure can buy you a lot of cover-ups for enormous crimes like what has been going on in Yemen for the past couple of years. And yes, the Saudi story about the killing of Khashoggi is full of holes. Every story that they've put forward is full of holes. If this was a rogue operation, and if 18 people were responsible, how is it that one of the senior security people for the Crown Prince and several of the personal bodyguards of the Crown Prince were involved? They just disappeared without anybody in the court realizing this. Every bit of the story is completely flimsy, and there's no question but that we're not being told the whole truth. It's very, very unlikely in a system that has been so highly centralized that this is exactly what happened, that the court and the Crown Prince himself didn't have any knowledge of what was going on. I can believe incompetence. I can believe that some things went wrong, but it's very, very hard to believe that nobody in the royal family had anything to do with this decision. That's inconceivable, given what we know about Saudi Arabia, and in particular about what we know about how things have been operating in the last 3 years, since Mohammed bin Salman basically took over everything from the other branches, members of the other branches of the royal family. So that story is clearly in large part nonsense, even if there may be parts of it that are true. And it's very obvious that there is a cover-up going on to shield the Crown Prince, who is King Salman's favorite son, and who has climbed over numerous princes, including his uncle, Ahmed ibn Abdulaziz, who was the Crown Prince at the time King Salman came to the throne, or was the next person in line, I should say, a brother of the king, one of the younger brothers of the king, and including his cousin, Mohammed bin Nayef, who had been in charge of Saudi anti-terrorism activities. And the last part of your wasn't really a question of the things that you laid out. As far as this issue of terrorism in the Middle East, well, there are many sources of what is called terrorism in the Middle East. Some of them are simply resistance to occupation. In the case of South Lebanon, in the case of Gaza, some of what is going on where it involves the killing of civilians can be correctly described as terrorism. But the killing of occupation forces or fighting against resisting occupation forces under international law is not illegal, and it's a complete distortion to call it terrorism. But as far as real terrorism, in other words, the jihadi terrorism that attacked the United States on September 11th, 2001, the terrorism that was unleashed by the Islamic State, the terrorism of Al-Qaeda and other parts of the Middle East and East Africa. There are sources, as you suggest, in Wahhabi ideology for much of what these folks have done. And there is an origin in Saudi, Pakistani American support for the jihad in Afghanistan of Al-Qaeda. In fact, one of the links to Osama bin Laden was none other than Jamal Khashoggi, the man who's just apparently been murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, operating apparently on behalf of Turki al-Faysan, who was at that stage the head of Saudi intelligence, and who later on became the ambassador first to London and then to Washington, and for whom Khashoggi worked as an advisor. So there's all kinds of things to be said about sources of terrorism in the Middle East. Another one of them is Israel. I mean, if you consider terrorizing the entire population of the Gaza Strip, which is the most overpopulated area in the Middle East, and which has been attacked multiple times by Israel, and where the casualty totals are one Israeli to 200 people killed by snipers in the last 8 or 12 weeks during these marches of the return, well, then who's the terrorist? The snipers who shoot down unarmed demonstrators, or the demonstrators themselves? So the very terms terror and terrorism, the very terms, are tools in an ideological war, which unfortunately is too often fought on ground friendly to people who themselves are often guilty of terrorism.
Well, I appreciate these insights. Thank you very much for coming on. Professor Rashid Khalidi, he is the author of The 100-Year War on Palestine. I'm Gary Null. We're out of time. Thank you all for watching. Have a nice day.